the Middle Ages. For centuries, they've been branded as the dark years of Europe, a 1,000-year stretch of superstition, stagnation, and ignorance. Renaissance scholars in 15th-century Italy were the first to call it that, using the term Middle Ages to dismiss the era as nothing more than a long, grim pause between the glory of ancient Rome and the rebirth of civilization in their own time. But that story is far too simple. There was no clean break between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. History doesn't work like a light switch. The Middle Ages were not a frozen period where nothing happened. In fact, they were a time of chaos, rebuilding, invention, and evolution, and they shaped the foundations of the world we live in today. This video isn't just about knights, castles, or kings. It's about what happened when Rome's empire collapsed and Europe had to reinvent itself from scratch. It's about how ordinary people survived an age of war, famine, and plague, and how those who broke society's rules were punished, feared, or cast out. Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and drop a comment with your thoughts. It really helps us to keep bringing you in-depth history documentaries. Thank you. Now let's dive back in. The story of the Middle Ages begins with ruins, invaders, and a struggle for survival. And it ends with the birth of a new world. Our story begins with the fall of Rome. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed under waves of northern barbarian invasions, Europe was left fractured and exposed. The old imperial order, roads, cities, armies, laws, crumbled. In its place came a new world, shaped by the conquerors who now ruled its ruins. These were not yet Christian kings or princes. In many cases, they were still pagans, bringing with them their own tribal laws and brutal codes of honor. Over time, though, the barbarian tribes converted to Christianity. This single change would transform Europe. The discovery of the immortal soul and the teachings of the Old and New Testaments began to reshape their behavior. The great fathers of the Christian faith worked to refashion the code of these tribes into something closer to a Christian moral order. What emerged was a fusion: Teutonic tribal custom mixed with Christianity and fragments of classical civilization. It created a society that saw itself as Christian above all else, but one that was still essentially military in spirit. Life was violent. The internal organization of these tribes had always been built for war. Even after they settled in conquered lands and learned the ways of the populations they ruled, they were forced to defend their new territories from fresh waves of raiders. The strong attacked the weak. Dynasties rose and fell by sword, club, poison, and dagger. The brief empire built by Charlemagne in the early 9th century seemed for a moment to offer unity. His rule stretched over large parts of continental Europe and promised a strong central authority. But it was too ambitious for its time. Within decades, it had collapsed, and the Christian West was once again fragmented. The chaos deepened as Europe came under constant attack from outside. From the east came the Magyars, threatening the borders. From the south, Saracens and Moors attacked along the Mediterranean coast and pushed overland from Muslim Spain. From the north and west, Vikings raided the coasts and sailed their longships far inland, even up the Seine as far as Paris. With no strong central power to protect them, Christian Europe broke apart into countless smaller units. This was the birth of feudalism, a system where ordinary men, powerless on their own, placed themselves and their property under the protection of a local warlord or strongman. In theory, this relationship was voluntary, a contract of mutual obligation. But over generations, many descendants of those free men who had once sworn loyalty to a protector found themselves in a much weaker position. They were no longer truly free. Society had outlawed the ownership of Christian slaves, but the serf, or villain, became something close to a chattel. Still, the serf was not considered an outsider or an enemy of society. On the contrary, he was an essential part of the feudal system, a necessary cog in the machine that kept medieval communities functioning. At the bottom, the peasant farmer bartered his labor and his small patch of land, and often his freedom, in exchange for protection. At the top, kings and emperors granted land to great magnates in return for military service. Those magnates then granted portions of land to lesser lords and so on, creating a chain of personal allegiances. This was the society that emerged from the ruins of Rome, a world built on war, faith, and survival. And though it was far from peaceful, it provided the stability needed for Europe to recover and eventually move forward. As Europe settled into this new order, the feudal system became the backbone of society. At its heart, feudalism was meant to be a contract. A man offered loyalty and service, and in return, he received protection and the right to work the land. In theory, obligations were mutual. In practice, things quickly shifted. Many of the descendants of those who had first pledged themselves to a lord discovered that their position had worsened over time. They had slipped from being free men into something closer to servants. Since Christian slavery was largely abolished, they were not technically slaves, but their lives were tied to the land and the demands of their lord. The serf, or villain, could not simply walk away. His lord might neglect his duties, but he was rarely slow to demand his rights. To many, this meant that they had become little more than property. Even so, the serf was seen as an integral part of the community, not as an outsider. Without him, the system would not function. This system operated on every level of society. At the base, the peasant farmer traded labor and his tiny plot of land for the promise of protection. At the higher levels, great magnates were granted land by kings and emperors. In exchange, they swore loyalty and promised service in war. Lesser lords received land from greater lords, and the chain continued downward. This marked a major shift from the older idea of loyalty to a single tribal chieftain. Now, society worked through an ascending ladder of personal allegiances. Authority was no longer a single, direct relationship. Justice itself was thought of as flowing down from the king's court at the top, through each layer of society, to the lord of the manor at the bottom. Because feudalism developed gradually, it was not identical everywhere in its early days. It grew out of immediate needs: protection, landholding, and survival, and its shape depended on the local situation. Over time, as it spread across Western Europe, it became more uniform. Slowly, the idea of a highly structured, multi-tiered society took hold. This hierarchy was appealing to the church. Its structure mirrored the Christian vision of a divine order, with authority descending from God, through the angels, through kings, and down to the common man. The church embraced this model, and its influence permeated every level of life. Ritual, duty, and obedience became deeply embedded in the European mindset. By the 10th and 11th centuries, this feudal order was firmly established. The system had managed to provide a framework for security during a time when war and raids had been constant threats. With the worst of those dangers eventually brought under control, society was ready to take its next step forward. But the stability of feudalism would not last forever. A shift was coming, one that would see towns rebuilt, trade revived, and kings begin to challenge the power of their great lords. By the middle of the 10th century, the tide of chaos had begun to turn. The great external threats that had terrorized Europe for centuries were finally being brought under control. In the east, the Magyars were defeated by Emperor Otto the Great at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955. After this victory, the Magyars converted to Christianity, becoming part of the Christian world they had once attacked. In the north, the Vikings also began to change. In 911, the Viking chieftain Rollo accepted the Duchy of Normandy in fief from the French king. He became a Christian and settled his followers there. By 1027, Canute, King of England and Denmark, was making pilgrimages to Rome. Soon after, Olaf I of Norway, who died in battle at Stiklestad in 1030, was canonized as a saint. The northern threat was no longer a threat at all. It had been absorbed into Christian Europe. In the south, the Saracens and Moors continued to resist conversion, holding to their own faith. But for the time being, they were held at bay. By the end of the 11th century, Christianity was firmly established as the dominant religion of Western Europe. The feudal system was the accepted social order. Yet even at its height, change was beginning. The old trade routes, which had been too dangerous to travel during the worst years of raiding, were safer again. Merchants began to move goods across Europe. Towns that had been little more than ruins since the early invasions were rebuilt. New towns were founded in key locations along trade routes. As trade revived, money started to circulate. Promissory bonds and other early financial tools came into use. The capital generated from commerce was reinvested into industries like weaving and other light manufacturing. These industries needed labor. People started leaving the countryside to find work in the towns. For many serfs, this was a chance at freedom. If a runaway villain managed to live in a town for a year and a day without being captured, he was considered free. Others simply bought their freedom outright. As the towns grew in size and wealth, they gained political power. Town councils bargained with their feudal lords for rights and freedoms. Many towns were able to buy independence and govern their own internal affairs. Some towns placed themselves directly under the authority of the king for protection. Others joined together in associations and leagues to defend their common interests. Craftsmen and merchants organized themselves as well, forming guilds. Each guild had its own officers, its own symbol, and often its own patron saint. For kings, this growing commercial world was a huge opportunity. They saw a way to free themselves from their dependence on powerful feudal lords. Instead of demanding knights and military service, they could demand taxes in money. With enough revenue, they could pay for professional soldiers and build standing armies that were better trained and better equipped than the old feudal levies. Kings also used this wealth to build stronger administrations. Professional bureaucrats were hired to manage lands, collect taxes, and keep records. This was the start of a slow shift from a fragmented feudal order towards strong, centralized monarchies. But while kings and merchants saw opportunity, not everyone was happy about these changes. For many, the rise of money and commerce felt like a threat to the old order. The tension between the new commercial world and the old feudal world would soon erupt. As trade and money became more important, not everyone celebrated the change. Many feudal lords, members of the church, and even ordinary people saw this new focus on money as dangerous. To them, it was the source of all evil. They believed that God was punishing the world for its greed with disasters, plagues, droughts, and floods. This attitude sparked a longing for a return to the old days, a time when everyone had a fixed place in society and performed their duties without ambition or concern for wealth. The idea of the great chain of being became central to how medieval people understood the world. It was a vision of the universe as a divine hierarchy. At the top was God, followed by angels, kings, nobles, and so on, all the way down to the poorest peasant and even to inanimate objects. In the mid-13th century, the philosopher and theologian St. Thomas Aquinas gave this vision its clearest expression in his Summa Theologica. Drawing on newly rediscovered writings of Aristotle, Aquinas built an ideal universe that was perfectly ordered and rooted in Christian faith. Every creature and object had its appointed place and function. As long as each part of this divine plan stayed where it belonged and did its duty, there was order. But if anyone stepped out of line, if anyone defied their place or acted against right reason, then disorder would follow. When things went wrong in the real world, people believed this was why. If crops failed, if famine spread, if comets blazed across the sky or swarms of locusts descended, it was seen as proof that someone, somewhere, was disrupting God's order. This belief was reinforced by the idea that the world was nearing its end. Many people thought history was in its sixth age out of 7, and that the Last Judgment was near. The coming of Antichrist was feared as a necessary prelude to the final reckoning. As materialism increased and society seemed to drift further from the ideal world, the authorities reacted by tightening control. They tried to save the old order by making it even stricter. Heresy was met with harsher punishment. Efforts to root out unorthodox belief often created more heretics instead of fewer. Fear of witches led to hunts that produced panic and accusations, which in turn seemed to prove the danger was real. Efforts to coerce the more restless elements of society often backfired, making those elements even more defiant. Meanwhile, intellectuals struggled with the growing gap between the ideal world of theology and the real world they could observe. Thinkers like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham argued that there were two separate kinds of knowledge: the physical and the divine. This distinction filtered down through society, and by the later Middle Ages, people had learned to live with what we might call double standards. On one side were the strict ideals of religion. On the other was the hard reality of self-interest and survival. To us, it might seem like hypocrisy, but to medieval people, both worlds were equally real. The divine order was just as true, and perhaps even more important, than the visible, everyday world. This tension between theory and reality created a society that was at once deeply devout and ruthlessly practical. It was a balance that held for centuries, but eventually it would be shattered, leading to what Renaissance thinkers would later call a rebirth. When Renaissance thinkers looked back at the centuries before their time, they saw an age of darkness and decline. To them, they were the saviors of civilization, rescuing Europe from 1,000 years of regression. But this view ignores what the Middle Ages really were. Far from being stagnant, the Middle Ages were an age of change. Ideas, institutions, and societies were constantly evolving. Systems were built, adapted, and abandoned as the needs of the time shifted. The entire fabric of Western civilization was reshaped during these centuries. Much of what we now consider the building blocks of Europe was either created or preserved during this time. The castles and cathedrals that still stand today are products of the medieval mind. So are the illuminated manuscripts, the works of Giotto and Fra Angelico, the poetry of Dante and Chaucer, the writings of Boccaccio and François Villon. Even the scientific revolution owed a debt to the Middle Ages. Copernicus, Erasmus, Kepler, Galileo, and Francis Bacon, all built on foundations laid in cathedral schools, monasteries, and the early universities that kept classical learning alive through centuries of turmoil. The spirit of the Middle Ages lived on in Shakespeare, who combined medieval themes with the early modern world. The Reformation that would transform Europe was also born from tensions that first arose in the late medieval period. The Middle Ages were not simply an interval between two golden ages. They were a crucial stage in the story of Europe, shaping the religion, politics, art, and philosophy that would dominate the centuries to come. For all its plagues, wars, and superstition, the period laid the groundwork for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the rise of the modern world. And this was only the surface. Behind the order and ceremony of medieval life were the outsiders, the heretics, witches, criminals, and rebels, who resisted or could not fit into the rigid structure of society. Their stories are just as much a part of this history, and they reveal what happened when the medieval system pushed people to the margins. What do you think? Was the Middle Ages really an age of darkness, or was it the birthplace of the modern world?